debilitating, humiliating defeat at Stalingrad in the new year of 1943 was the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. No more heady, stupendous victories, only vicious, blood-spilling defeats. So much of the best blood had already been spilled in the snow and dust. Germany had precious few men left to spend in this enormous waste of Russian land. In 18 months, she had lost 2,300,000 men. She could not win this kind of war. Russia could. But it would take 2 more terrible years. The Germans had been dispossessed of the future. There was no great citadel to fall back on, no secure Germany to escape to. There was only attrition and death. As long as they lived, the Germans fought. Some would fight on into 1946, not for the long-lost Nazi cause, but for Ukrainian independence. But all the while, the ranks thinned, and the survivors became the victims, one by one. This was the Russian-German War. Another spring faithfully broke the bounds of winter. Leningrad was still besieged, still numbed by hunger, still cowed by German bombardment. Yet people risked their lives in pathetic attempts to be normal. They swept the streets, washed the windows, shopped in the empty shops, and were cheered to hold out forever if necessary by the mere sight of a tram running again. A German defeat was no longer something everyone prayed for, but something everyone expected. Churchill and Roosevelt met at Casablanca and declared that Germany would not be allowed to do less than surrender unconditionally. Hitler would not be allowed to escape the penalties for what he had done to the world. Goebbels, who was surpassed only by Hitler in his ability to scream Nazi blood into a boil, soared with the challenge as the German fortunes fell.
Wir bereit, mit dem Führer als Phalanx der Heimat hinter der kämpfenden Wehrmacht stehen, diesen Kampf mit wilder Entschlossenheit und unbeirrt durch alle Schicksalsprüfungen fortzusetzen, bis der Sieg in unseren Händen ist.
Hitler badly needed a victory, but how, or what, or where? The generals implored him, showered him with plans, plotted for his attention. Tempers burst. Field Marshal von Kluge challenged General Guderian to a duel. At last, the finger pointed to this place, the Kursk salient, a great bulge of Russian troops in the middle of the German line. It began as an idea for an obvious and limited offensive battle and grew into a plan of enormous proportions, but it was only a plan. A nervous and now uncertain Hitler set a date in April and then canceled it. April passed into May, and May into June, and June into July, before he reluctantly let it happen. As the time passed, the thing got bigger and bigger. As the watches ticked synchronously down to the final hour and the first tank treads broke the soil, the biggest battle of World War II and the most massive tank battle the world would ever see was about to take place. It was no surprise to the Russians. They knew more about Hitler's plan than some of his own generals, the date, the place, the strength, the objective. "17 Panzer Divisions heaved mightily at the Russian line. A few hours later, the Russians heaved back. 20,000 Russian guns ripped the night into shreds of day. 1,000 banks of Katyusha rockets screamed at the Germans. The Germans were enticed into a deadly trap. The Russians left no detail to fortune. Blitzkrieg was the most ingenious and formidable tactic of war ever devised. The Russians found its fatal flaw. Each of its parts had a weakness. The Stukas, the guns, the tanks, the infantry. Each counted on the others to compensate for its weakness. Yet between these layers of firepower, separate them, and the Blitzkrieg could be broken. So the Russians, their guns stilled, their courage unbroken, waited for the tanks to run over them. Then they could get between the panzers and the infantry. Then they could destroy them. Come on! Russians had other new tactics. Anti-tank guns in units of 10 were maneuvered like galleons, their sights training on a single target. Few German tanks survived a broadside from 10 guns. In all, 6,100 tanks fought each other on this enormous battlefield. Both sides lost heavily. The Germans lost irreparably. The Panzer armies, the great knife edge of German military strength, were broken. They would never be replaced. The Germans could do no more than dent the Russian defenses. With some of the most skillful and courageous fighting this war had ever seen, they got no deeper than 10 miles, 100 miles short of surrounding the Russians. Hitler had given his enemy the whole spring and part of the summer to prepare for this struggle. The time was not wasted. They built not one, not two, not three, but 8 defensive belts 180 miles deep. When the Germans were stopped, the Russians were ready with a stunning counteroffensive and followed that with a separate, full-scale offensive. German estimates of Russian fighting skill had to be revised for the last time. These men were not just courageous. They had survived this terrible struggle long enough to acquire the gut-hard skills which made them the equal of the Germans. Perhaps only the German army could have withstood what the Russians did at Kursk. The Ss Panzer Divisions, Hitler's pampered specialists, were hammered brutally. Their arrogance was not diminished, only tempered by a fatalism which grew into fanaticism. The very names of these divisions struck fearful, discordant sounds. SS Leibstandarte, SS Das Reich, SS Totenkopf. Totenkopf. The Death's Head Division did not attempt to give up. They knew they would be shot on sight. The Russians celebrated prematurely. But there had been so little reason to cheer in these 2 terrible, awesome years. As the Germans were pressed back in stubborn retreat, they were harassed without respite by the Russian army behind their lines, the partisans. By now, there were not less than 500,000 of these men and women who roamed the countryside in packs and dogged the Germans like jackals. As towns and villages were abandoned in the retreat, they exploded in hatred. Revenge was not to be sweetened by even the smallest gesture of compassion. For collaborators, partisan justice was swift, unquestioning, and brutal. The evidence of the collaborators' duplicity in aiding the German extermination squads was to be found here. Even those who had believed the very worst were stunned to incredulity. At Babi Yar, they found the bodies of 100,000, most of them Jews. Crimes against humanity. The phrase didn't begin to express the revulsion. The Germans had been invincible. They were no longer. Some Russians now thought they could defeat Germany single-handedly. 2/3 of the occupied territory had been recaptured. It seemed only a matter of pushing on into Germany until it was over. But Stalin knew that his whole country was war-weary. The effort had been colossal, almost superhuman. These people needed something to cheer them on, and an invasion in the West could do that. Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler and the others were now troubled. They responded with new plots, double-cross, and more murder. The men who had to fight on in the name of Nazism knew the sides had changed. What was happening to Germany was happening to them in the soulless chill of a new Russian winter. As the year turned, the Germans were bludgeoned by an explosive series of Russian offensives. The indomitable Leningrad was suddenly relieved after 880 days of siege. There were 600,000 survivors out of the original 3 million inhabitants. More than 1 million had escaped. More than 1 million had died. Hitler ordered his men to stay and fight. As the fury of the Russian shock armies hit them, they fled, abandoning the sick and wounded. In a week, they found themselves not in Russia, but Estonia, heavy with a misery greater than anything they had known in this miserable war. As the narrow roads filled up and became traps for hundreds of vehicles, other Germans went efficiently about the business of destroying anything which could be of use to the Russians. In the western Ukraine, on the very day that Hitler had called his generals back to East Prussia to give them a schoolboy lecture on Nazism, the Russians struck hard and surrounded 60,000 men. Eventually, the pace of fighting slowed, as it had in the previous winters. The Russians were still up against the German army. Some of its members had fought this war from the beginning. They had the tenacity of survivors. They did not die easily or foolishly. There were other survivors. Most were barely able to speak their horror. The extermination squads had set boastful records. In one place, in 2 days, they had murdered 33,771 people. Hitler still felt he could part the seas and master fate by his own command. Generals begged for retreat. No retreat, said Hitler, and he sacked them. In the Crimea, the Russians again trapped a whole German army. No retreat. The Crimea was lost, and with it more than 100,000 troops. The Germans now employed their genius to scorch the earth in their wake. In some places, there was little left to destroy. In 4 months, the partisans alone blew up the rail lines in 200,000 places, wrecked more than 1,000 trains, more than 800 locomotives. The Germans finished off what was left. D-Day still hadn't happened, but the skies over German territory were filled with the bombs and bombers of the West, the British by night, the Americans by day. One of the prime targets, the long and dangerous run on the Plesty oil fields in Romania, Hitler's last source of natural petroleum. In the eye of this hurricane, German arms production surprisingly was rising and would hit its peak in this year of 1944. The tale was now turned round, and it was the German nation which was being mobilized for survival. The work went on round the clock. Even Russian prisoners, who until now had been left to waste to death in the slow agony of starvation, were raised up to the rank of slave laborers and fed enough to sustain them in a pitiful day's work. The Hitler Youth, its senior ranks getting younger and younger, assembled parts for the weapons which would soon be theirs. The only Germans hard-pressed for something to do were among the 2.5 million men held down in the West, waiting for the Americans, British, and Canadians to invade. They made toys by the tens of thousands for the children they had left behind them, and proudly and happily posed for the German newsreel cameras. Germany's fate was fixed in June of 1944. No one, not even Hitler, from that time on could have any doubt of what the end would be. The Channel invasion on the 6th of June caught the Germans by surprise. They would never recover enough to throw the invaders back into the sea. On June 22nd, 3 years to the very day that they had been surprised by the Germans, the Russians doubled the D-Day blow with a massive offensive of their own. They attacked with 166 divisions on a front of 450 miles. Whole German divisions, corps, armies were surrounded, overwhelmed, swept away, and disappeared. 300,000 men were lost. 57,000 of those who lived were marched through Red Square. The Russians pointedly washed down the pavement after they had gone.